All right, so today we are going to look at an old debate. It's from 2011, so more than 14 years ago. But it's between Dan Wallace and Bart Ehrman, and it's on basically the textual reliability of the New Testament. And so we're going to be looking at that today. I'm not going to be watching the whole debate. I feel that would be stealing someone else's content, so instead I'm going to be stopping and talking about concepts, and you can find actually the whole debate on other people's channels. I think Bart has it on his, and I don't know if Dan Wallace even has a YouTube channel. He probably does, but you can find this debate. It will be on YouTube most likely. But we're going to watch about half of it, because about half of it is where the meat of everything is. You know, we're not going to watch the Q&A or any of that stuff. But if you're interested, I'll have a link down in the show notes for you to see it. So let's get this started.
Can we trust the New Testament? This question could mean a number of different things. It could mean, is the New Testament historically accurate? It might mean, is it theologically true? It might mean, is it internally consistent? Those are all important questions, but they are not our focus tonight. Instead, our focus is on a more specific question: can we trust the text of the New Testament? And by text, we mean quite literally the words that make up the New Testament. Can we know the original text? Can we know the exact words the original authors wrote? Or has the text become so garbled by the mistakes and intentional changes by scribes over the centuries that we can no longer know what the texts originally were?
Yeah, is it faithful
Another way of thinking
transmission,
about
or
this
is it
question is to
garbled
ask this: how badly did ancient and medieval scribes corrupt the text of the New Testament?
Yeah, were they careful copiers, or is it
This is a crucial question for properly understanding the New Testament. And as our speakers will note, we do not have any of the original manuscripts that the biblical writers produced.
Nope.
We don't have a single original, not a single autograph.
Yeah, not a single autograph. Okay, so for those who don't know, an autograph is a manuscript or document written by its author. So that's, if the Gospel of Mark is written by Mark, the autograph of that manuscript would be the actual paper and ink used by Mark. That's just what an autograph means.
I refer you to the glossary in your program for definitions of technical terms like autograph. Instead of autographs, what we have are copies, or rather, copies of copies, or even copies of copies of copies. On the one hand, we're fortunate to have thousands of these copies, over 5,800 Greek manuscripts of various sizes, with more still being discovered. For example, a team from the center led by Dr. Wallace just this past spring discovered 4 new Greek biblical manuscripts in Athens. In addition to Greek manuscripts, we also have thousands more manuscripts in languages like Latin, Coptic, Ethiopic, Slavic, Georgian, Armenian, Syriac. We also have quotes and allusions to the New Testament from various ancient writers. So this is a remarkable set of data. Think of the skill set that scholars...
Okay, he only mentions that there are some references from ancient writers. He kind of tacks it on the end there. We actually have more attestation through that kind of mention than we have manuscripts. I've heard it said before that there are certain books of the Bible that if we completely lost all manuscripts of them, we could pretty much reconstruct the entirety of the Bible, except for, I think, 3rd John and 2nd Peter, I think. There are sections of them that we're not sure. That just aren't mentioned because they reiterate things from previous books. So, if an author wants to make a certain point, they'll quote the first appearance and not quote the section of 3rd John or 2nd Peter. And so that's what you get. But anyway, we'll keep going here.
Scholars have to work to actually read all of these languages. This is why text criticism is one of the most difficult subfields of biblical studies in which to work.
Yeah, textual criticism is not only difficult, but it's kind of an art form. Paleography is probably just as difficult, but there's less reconstructive work, I think. Maybe that's inaccurate. I'll leave that alone and let's just keep going.
Abundance of data, however, creates its own set of problems. We have all of these manuscripts, but they differ from each other because of the text variants introduced by scribes. When we compare the different readings, can we determine that one reading is more likely to be original than the others? If not, if we can't construct the original text, how far back can we push it? How early can we get? And if we can't determine the original text, how much does it matter? These are the sorts of questions that text critics tackle. And we're fortunate to have two of the best-known text critics in the world, Daniel B. Wallace and Bart D. Ehrman. We'll see that when they examine the evidence, they find much with which to agree with each other, but they find much on which they disagree. Ehrman has argued that we can't always know the original text of the biblical writers, while Wallace's center is devoted to the great and noble task of determining the autographs of the New Testament. That's a quote from the center's website. For Ehrman, we will always have significant gaps in our knowledge of the original text unless an autograph turns up. For Wallace, while the task of determining the original is not complete, it can be done, and we are well on our way to doing it. Clearly, they disagree.
We're well
and
on
yet,
our way
as you'll
to doing
see,
it.
despite their differences,
Yeah, we're definitely well on our way to doing it. You'll see it borders on the ridiculous, the objections, but just we'll keep going.
they obviously have great professional respect for each other.
Yeah.
Our format for tonight is laid out in the program. Each scholar will present an opening argument of approximately 30 minutes. First, Dr. Ehrman, then Dr. Wallace. After the opening arguments, the two will have opportunities to respond to each.
Yeah, we'll likely just make it through the opening arguments on this, because you'll see the insufficiency of one side, let's say.
Other, and then another round of response after that. Afterwards, there will be time for questions from the audience, and we'll conclude with closing arguments, first by Dr. Ehrman and then by Dr. Wallace. You will then go home and debate who won.
Yeah, that's another thing. Two different types of people can watch this debate and come up with a drastically different point of view as to what happened or what point was really impactful to that person. That sometimes a completely lost debate can have a fan say that person won. But anyway, let's keep going here.
I'll introduce each speaker before his opening argument, and now I'll begin. Bart D. Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Teacher in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He earned his BA from Wheaton College, his Master of Divinity and PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary, where he worked with famed text critic Bruce Metzger. After teaching for a few years at Rutgers University, he arrived at the University of North Carolina in 1988. Ehrman has lectured all over the world, but you don't have to leave home to listen to him. He's videotaped several lecture series through the Teaching Company. You may have encountered him on his numerous radio and television appearances on CNN and on shows like Fresh Air with Terry Gross, The Diane Rehm Show, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and even The Colbert Report twice. Unfortunately, New Testament scholars, by definition, are unable to reach any level of cool. So, nice try.
Yeah, it's hard to make scholarship cool at one point, or well, I guess multiple points in antiquity. Being a scholar was the thing to be. If you were a scholar, you were something. Now it seems like if you're not a sports figure or a famous actor or something like that, you're just not cool. So scholarship isn't cool anymore. We need to make scholarship great again. Anyway, let's keep going here.
Ehrman has authored, co-authored, or edited 26 books. That was yesterday's count. It may be outdated.
So that's a lot.
Many of these have been enormous.
That is a huge body of work for a scholar. Now, some of them, probably a good number of them, are popular level books, so it's not as rigorous as it sounds, but it's still, I mean, it's 30 books. And that was 14 years ago, so he's probably got a lot more now.
Enormously successful. At least 4 have made it onto the New York Times bestseller list, which never happens for biblical scholarship.
Yeah, almost never
And
happens.
turning biblical scholarship into bestsellers,
popular books.
Dr. Ehrman has inadvertently proven that miracles do happen.
Was that a dig? Bart Ehrman has inadvertently proven that miracles do happen. I think it's no question that the moderator, or is he the moderator, or is he just introducing them? I don't know, but yeah, he has some bias there. But it was a good joke. I enjoyed it a lot. So did Bart, apparently.
His books range from technical studies of inscriptions and particular text critical problems to widely used introductory textbooks such as the New Testament, an historical introduction to early Christian writings, which just entered its 5th edition, to works on the historical Jesus, the lost Gospel of Judas, and Peter, Paul, and Mary Magdalene. His most recent book, just out, is Forged, Writing in the Name of God, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. For our purposes, I would like to highlight 3 other books. He's the co-author with the late Bruce Metzger of the 5th edition of the classic book, The Text of the New Testament, which is a standard reference for students and scholars alike. He also wrote The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, the effect of early Christological controversies on the text of the New Testament, in which he argued that some of the changes scribes made to the biblical text were theologically motivated. He continues this same.
This argument irks me. Some of the changes are theologically motivated. Ooh. He's talking about one in particular, 1 John 5:7, which we know what theological controversy spurred the person to make the note in the manuscript that ended up copied into the text. But it's completely disingenuous to pretend like what the insertion says is inconsistent with the rest of the text. Like, oh, the text said something else, and they added stuff to make it say this thing, and that's not really what that passage even does. It just makes the point more explicit, but whatever. Anyway, let's keep going.
Argument in the more popular level book, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why, which is a very readable introduction to text criticism for those just beginning to learn about it. In short, he has thought quite a bit and written quite a lot on the issues under discussion.
Just right quick, Misquoting Jesus was my introduction to textual criticism, and at first introduced a lot of doubts into my mind. But you'll see, I kept looking and kept searching and found the satisfactory answers. But anyway, so that's true. Let's keep going.
Tonight. Bart, we welcome you here tonight, and we ask, can we trust the text of the New Testament?
Also, I want to give Bart Ehrman his props. Bart, because of the nature of his work, he pretty much is restricted to talking to Christian audiences, at least in his appearances. So it's sort of like having to go into the lion's den. So just briefly, I'll just say that, I mean, that takes a lot of bravery on his part. Not that there's anything dangerous about it, but just the discomfort level of having to speak in front of people who you know don't like your points very much, and you know completely disagree with you, and but he kind of has to do it, so it is what it is, I guess. I don't know. Do you think that I don't know, atheist group conventions or any other religious organizations might want Bart to speak at them? I don't know. I don't know what percentage it must be. Also, I mean, it's the same thing with like Bart's YouTube channel. How many people are quote unquote hate watching the channel? They just completely disagree with Bart, but they're going to watch it, and that he gets the view. So cry into your dollar bills, right? But anyway, I just wanted to point out that it was a very bold thing he's doing to come into an opposing place with opposing people. It shows academic honesty, I think, to do something like that. That he's actually, yes, he's biased, yes, he has a point he wants to make, but so does the other debater. Like, it's not, that doesn't, distinguish Bart from Dan Wallace, in this case for sure. But it does, in fact, mean something positive about Bart. So anyway.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Mark, and thank you all for coming out. So just to get things started, let me ask, how many of you would consider yourselves Bible-believing Christians? Right, okay. How many of you are here to see me get creamed? Right.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a way for Bart to connect to the audience. He's done this several times in debates. He's just like, how many people want to see me get creamed? I don't know what his position on debating actually is, if he actually wants to debate, or if it's just a means of funding his process. It's like, hey, I went to this debate, buy my book. I don't know, but it's a... it's an interesting opener to say, hey, how many of you want to see me lose the debate? In a room full of people, and most of which want to see him lose the debate. But anyway.
Right.
He's also a little bit nervous. Who can blame him, right? But anyway, I didn't even have to point that out. It just came out.
Okay. All right, so all I ask is that you approach it with an open mind. I have long thought about these issues, as Mark was pointing out. I did my PhD with Bruce Metzger, who was the world's leading scholar in text criticism.
Yes.
I was his final PhD student. I did both a master's thesis and a PhD dissertation under him. And then when I graduated from Princeton Seminary, I wrote.
Imagine being in Bruce Metzger's position. Because he's a Christian man, and he's putting through a few students through PhD programs, and the last person he puts through is Bart Ehrman, who is sort of at that point doing a 180 on his own personal beliefs and isn't convinced of the truth of these things while he's looking at them, and has a completely drastically different opinion from probably a large number of his peers. I think it means something interesting. I think it puts Bruce in the odd position of both pride. I mean, there's no question that Bart earned his stripes, so to speak, in that environment. And he's done some interesting work. But for Bruce Metzger, it's like, wow, he gained the whole world, but lost his own soul. That had to be rough for Bruce, I would think. I mean, I don't know. That's all speculation. I'm just talking into a camera here. But it's interesting. I wonder what that was like. I wonder what that was like for both of them, both Bart and Bruce. Anyway, let's keep going here.
For several years, nothing except for books on textual criticism. I decided a number of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, to try and write a book for popular audiences to explain what it is scholars have said about this field, and that was the book Misquoting Jesus that Mark mentioned. I should say that when I wrote Misquoting Jesus, that's not the title that I wanted to give it. You may not know this, but scholars who write books for popular audiences usually don't give the titles to the book. They're not allowed to give the titles to the book, and it's not a title that I wanted. Actually, since the book deals with how the New Testament had been transmitted over the centuries by scribes who sometimes changed the text, my preferred title for the book was Lost in Transmission, which I thought was a pretty good title. My publisher, though, decided against it because they thought that in places like Texas, if we called it Lost in Transmission and somebody went to the Barnes & Noble and saw it on the shelf, they would assume that it was a book about NASCAR.
That's also not the first time I've heard him make that joke. I don't know if it's I don't know why he does the jokes. I don't know if it's an effort to put him at ease, or an effort to connect with the audience, or an effort to just put the audience at ease. If he thinks, is he trying to ingratiate himself to him so that he doesn't have any problems? Does he anticipate a problem where he would need to bring it down like that? I don't know. But it's something he's done repeatedly, and Lost in Transmission instead of Misquoting Jesus. It's funny. Anyway, back to it.
I suggested that might improve sales.
As an aside, I don't know how many copies of Misquoting Jesus have sold, but I don't think it is a struggling popular book, particularly not in the popular level textual criticism category. It's pretty much a barrier breaker of a book. Of course, again, a lot of it isn't people who are convinced by the material of the book, but it's people who want to have the book to see what is presented. It's hate readers, hate book buyers. But again, Bart's making his money. Good for him. Somebody has to be wrong, I guess. Anyway, let's keep going.
Can we trust the text of the New Testament? To get to this question, I need to give a little bit of background about how we got the New Testaments. When you read the New Testament today, you pick up the Gospel of Mark and you read the words and you assume you're reading the words that Mark wrote. Of course you assume that. But you're reading them in English and Mark wrote in Greek. And are you reading the words that Mark himself actually wrote, even if they are correctly translated from Greek into English?
Hi, I'm JT and I made Result Hunter, the search engine for conservatives. Let me just tell you what it does. First of all, big tech.
Now, Bart, you know that I read it in English like Jesus wrote it. Anyway, let's keep going.
First, we have to think about the original Mark. We don't know who Mark was. We don't know where he lived. We don't know when he was writing. It's usually thought that he was a Greek-speaking Christian writing sometime around the year 70, so about 40 years after Jesus' death. And some people think he was writing in Rome. I don't know where he was writing. Let's say he was writing in Rome. Let's say he's writing in Rome around the year 70. Mark wrote down an account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. This book that he wrote was put into circulation the way books were typically put in circulation in the ancient world. It got handed around. If somebody wanted a copy of the book, they couldn't simply go to the Barnes & Noble. There wasn't a Barnes & Noble, and the book had not been mass-produced. It had been written either by Mark himself or by a scribe by hand. If somebody wanted to have a copy of their own, they had to make a copy, or to have somebody else make a copy for them. And so Mark was eventually copied. Maybe Mark was copied many times. Maybe he was copied only a couple of times. But once it was copied, more copies were needed, and so some people copied the copies. And then some people copied the copies of the copies. And some people copied the copies of the copies of the copies of the copies. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to write out a copy of one of the books of the New Testament, like the Gospel of Mark, but I can guarantee you, if you do that, you're going to make a mistake. You might make lots of.
Okay, I'm going to stop it here for a minute. The point he's trying to make is it's like a game of telephone. You know, that the first person whispers to the next person and gets it a little wrong. And the next person whispers to the next person and gets it a little different. The problem, and I think probably Dan Wallace will point this out, but is there's actually evidence of a copyist mistake being corrected, being informed by the previous copies, meaning that with the problem with the telephone game is that once you transmit from, say, person 1 to person 2, and from person 2 to person 3, there's no way for person 3 to go back and be informed by person 1. That's not true with manuscript transmission. You can have person 3 going back and rediscovering person 1's manuscript and saying, oh, person 2 did this thing and we thought it was correct, but let's go back and fix that issue. And particularly in the case of something where you want to be as accurate as possible. You know there's inaccuracy going around with other documents that aren't written by apostles and claiming to be written by apostles and so on, like the plight of the early church. The transmission is not really at all the same as a game of telephone, and that's the major problem with Bart's argument here. But let's let him finish here what he's saying.
Mistakes. And you are much more highly educated and literate than the vast majority of early Christians. Mistakes happen when people copy texts. And the problem is, when somebody copies a text and makes a mistake, the next person who copies the copy replicates the mistakes of his predecessor. And
Exactly. He's trying to say there's absolutely no way for the person 3 to ask person 1 or to look at person 1's manuscript and say, what did they write? What was actually written? That there's not, instead of this straight line, ... you have a cloud of information from a perceived authoritative source. Either the church saying this was produced by Mark, or Mark himself when Mark was still alive. There's still a call back to that point. Now that's not true for, say, on a 9th century copy, but it would be true for a 3rd or 2nd century copy. It just got more complicated later on because of the geographic spread of Christianity. But even like by the 4th century, you could still, there were different versions, but you could go back and trace where they came from. They didn't just fall out of the sky. Manuscripts don't just fall out of the sky. They come from somewhere. And I think that Bart's position discredits that simple fact. But anyway, let's keep going. I'm sure Dan Wallace, when we get to him and his opening statement, will address some of that also.
he makes mistakes of his own, and then somebody comes along and copies that copy. And when they copy that copy, they replicate the mistakes of both of their predecessors, and they make their own mistakes. And then somebody copies that copy. And it goes on like that for year after year after year. The only time mistakes get corrected is when a scribe is copying a text and they realize, oh, this copy has a mistake. And they try to correct the mistake. But they don't know what the original said. They're just trying to make it right. It's possible that when somebody tries to correct a mistake, that they correct it incorrectly.
This point that Bart is making is true. However, if, let's say, the quick brown dog did something, and the next person writes, the quick red dog did something, the third person is still going to be informed by the context of, that we're talking about the color of a dog. They're not going to say purple, are they? And this is the point I think Bart doesn't want to see in this context, that you don't work from nebulous nothing to do a translation or a copy. You have contextual clues that lead us to understand things. And that's actually how you can reconstruct autographs also. You know that the copies that say the purple dog did something, that those can be discarded because it's incoherent. It doesn't make sense. So anyway, we'll keep going here.
In which case, you've got the original copy, you've got the mistake, and you've got the mistake and correction of the mistake. 3 forms of the text, and then somebody copies that form of the text. And it goes on like that. Month after month, year after year, decade after decade. And so you get copies of the copies of the copies.
If a man really hated ads, here's what he would do. Day 1, he would install Pi on his computer without spending a...
We don't have the original version of Mark. We don't have the book he wrote. We don't have the first copy made of Mark, or any of the first copies, or copies of the copies, and we don't have copies of the copies of the copies of Mark.
Let's stop there for a second. We don't have the originals. We don't have the copies. We don't have the copies of the copies. We don't have the copies of the copies of the copies. How does he know this? No, if you're going to say that the autograph is written by Mark, if you're going to concede that point, I think you have a problem, particularly if you're someone like Bart. But additionally, how do you know you don't have what he wrote? If you don't have it to compare to, if you... what I'm getting at, let me back up. What I'm getting at is that Bart's argument is difference of the gaps. Because we don't have it, he's saying it says, how do we know that what it says today is what it said when Mark wrote it? I don't think that's Bart Ehrman being particularly honest, because you're assuming it's different. Sure, you're saying it could be completely different, but what he's really saying is it's actually different. Like if you listen to other things that Bart has said, he's not just, oh, I'm just asking questions. I'm making the academic observation. Is that what you're doing, Bart? Is that what you're doing? Because often when he's interviewed, he's asked questions about events that are depicted in the Gospels and so on, and he'll say something like, well, I don't think that really happened. Okay, so then what you're saying is that what's written down isn't what happened. So the only two options are either they were inserted later by someone, or the person who originally wrote it lied. And if either one of those two things is true, then of course you can't believe what's been written, right? That's Bart Ehrman's position. The problem is you're denying an event depicted in the Gospels, but you're not countering it with any other kind of evidence. You're just casting an aspersion, right? You're just saying, oh, well, I don't believe it, and this is the only source for this. Well, number one, that's not how you determine truth. You don't say, well, this is the only one that mentions it, so it didn't happen. You would have to have either a version of events from another source countering it, or saying it didn't happen, or you would even have to have contesting sources, sources from, say, Jews or Romans that basically say something else happened there, right? But to just say, well, this source says it, but this is a biased source, so I'm just not going to believe it, that's not even how historians do history. I mean, yes, you can, as an individual, say, hey, that's not enough for me. But you can't really say, well, I think this alternative version of history that is completely unattested is superior to this version of history that's only attested a little bit. That's not how you do history. But anyway, so let's keep going.
Mark. Mark's book was copied for very many years before we have any copy. The first copy we have of Mark is a manuscript that scholars have called P45. Now, they call it P45 because it's written on papyrus, which was the ancient equivalent of paper. It was the writing material people used to use, and it's called P45 because this happens to be the 45th papyrus manuscript of the New Testament that was cataloged. And so it's called P45. This is what it looks like. This is one page of P45. You can see that that it is not a complete page. As you can see, there are holes in the manuscript here and here, and some of the margin is missing here. But this is actually one of the best preserved pages of this manuscript, P45. P45 is not a complete manuscript of Mark. Obviously, there's some things missing on this particular page. It doesn't have anything from the first 3 chapters. It starts with chapter 4, this surviving fragment we have. It's not entire, it's just fragmentary. This copy has only 5 verses from Mark chapter 4, and then it has verses from
all the oldest versions of pretty much anything will be fragmentary. That's the nature of papyrus. But anyway.
Following 8 chapters. It goes from basically chapter 4 to chapter 12. So it doesn't have the last 4 chapters. It doesn't have the first 3 chapters. So it's missing the first 3, the last 4. And it has some bits of the stuff in between. This is our first copy of the Gospel of Mark that survived, except for small fragments. We have a small scrap or 2 here or there, but this is basically the first copy of any use to us. So it's our oldest copy, and it's usually dated to around the year 220 CE or AD 220. Now, if Mark was written in the year 70, that means this copy was made 150 years after the original, and it's our first copy. This kind of time gap is not unusual in the New Testament. This is the kind of time gap we're talking about for most of the books of the New Testament, not just the Gospel of Mark, for most of them. I'm just using Mark as an illustration.
Just to stop that for a second, I will say we have references to the Gospel of Mark in other writings of antiquity, but Bart would say something like, to support Bart's point, Bart would say something like, well, it only references these sections. What about the other sections? So this is just, a fact-finding mission to find fault, rather than trying to do an actual reconstruction to find it, which when we get to Dan Wilson's section, I'm sure he'll talk about that also. But anyway, let's keep going.
We don't have a complete copy of the Gospel of Mark until the middle of the 4th century.
Right.
Until about the middle of the 4th century, 300 years of copying before we have a complete copy that survives. There were lots of copies made before this complete copy, and there were lots of copies made before P45. P45 is not a copy of the original Mark. It's a copy probably of a copy made a few years earlier, which was a copy of a copy made a few years earlier, which was a copy of a copy made a few years earlier, and so on and so on. There have been numerable stages between the original and our first copy. How many mistakes had crept into the text before we start getting copies? There's no way to know, because we don't have earlier copies.
Okay, I'll emphasize again. we have references to the Gospels, all four, and just four. We have these references from ancient sources, starting in even the 1st century, going all the way to the 4th century that he's talking about. There's multiple, dozens and dozens, particularly up to the 4th century. Like if you say the 1st century, there's probably less than a dozen sources, I would say. Then 2nd century, it doubles. And so then by the 4th century, it's who knows how many there probably are that reference the gospel material. If Bart wants to say that, well, this person over here had this drastically different, this person over here had this drastically different, then you have to have attestation for those differences between that time area. You cannot, we know that today we hold different copies with different scribal errors and so on that have crept in, but it's not nearly so ubiquitous or widespread as Bart would have you believe, for sure, and it's not wildly different. Like, there's not a legitimate gospel version that says, dinner leader died and we didn't know what to do, so we just kind of sat around. And then, Peter and James cooked up this idea, hey, let's dress up somebody and make them look like the risen Jesus, or just there's no version that makes it appear as if Bart's personal version of history is what actually happened. He's reconstructing that to deny what is in the text. But it's easier to do that if you first admit that the text is accurate. I mean, just because the text is accurate, then you have to breach the gap between, well, okay, even if the text is reliably what is stated, does that mean it's theologically true? That's a whole other thing. And I think to avoid this nebulous area of theology, I think Bart is sort of staying in his lane and saying, well, we don't know what could have been said, except that we do. And anyway, let's keep going.
These are the earliest. The first complete copy, 300 years after. How many intervening stages of copying was it?
Okay, I have to stop again. Because he's really pushing this point of we don't have a complete copy of Mark until the 4th century. Well, okay, but we have references to Mark, and we have pieces and fragmentary pieces that are earlier. So to believe that the 4th century copy isn't actually a good representation at all of the autograph is to try to say something that is attested by zero evidence. That's what it boils down to. So anyway, let's let him talk.
We simply don't know. We can't know because we don't have the manuscripts to tell us. This again is not simply true for the Gospel of Mark. It's true for all of the books of the New Testament. It seems like when you buy the New Testament that we know what's in it because you go to the bookstore and you buy a New Testament, and you go to another bookstore, you buy the New Testament. It's the same thing, but not in the ancient world. If you lived in Rome and you read a copy of Mark and then you went to Ephesus and read a copy of Mark, you might be reading two different copies with two different wordings of this passage or that passage. These copies are circulating throughout the Roman world. Wherever Christians were, they wanted copies of the Gospels. If you wanted a copy of the Gospel and you lived in Ephesus, but it was made in Rome, you had to make a copy in Rome and take it to Ephesus. And then you made a copy that was maybe a copy of the copy of the copy. So maybe you're making a copy of a copy that in fact had a lot of mistakes in it, but that's the copy you have now in Ephesus. And suppose somebody from Colossae wants a copy. Well, they come to Ephesus and they make a copy of this mistaken copy, and that's the gospel they have in Colossae. And then suppose somebody from Antioch wants a copy. Well, they come to Colossae and they make a copy there of this errant copy that's based on copies of the copies of the copies. And it circulates around the Roman world like this, with everybody making mistakes and no way for us to know what mistakes had been made at the early stages. That's the problem we're confronted with the text of the New Testament. So, what can we say about our surviving copies? Well, the good news is we have lots of copies of the New Testament. We have lots more copies of the New Testament than for any other book in the ancient world. We have so many more copies than we have of Plato, or of Euripides, or of Homer, or of Aeschylus. Name your author. We have far more copies of the New Testament than any. So that's the good news.
Okay. That's not only the good news, that's the great news. Ask Bart how many of those embarrassingly huge level of copies denies the crucifixion, denies the resurrection, denies that Jesus is God. How many? Oh, that doesn't matter, does it? Because they're all copies of each other, so of course they're going to say similar. Well, wait a minute. You just said it was a telephone game where things got changed. Anyway, let's keep going.
The bad news is we don't have any of the early copies. It's nice that we have copies from later centuries, but we don't have the copies that we want, which are the copies from the early centuries. What can we say about the ages of these copies? Well, the oldest copy of Mark is P45, which we looked at from the year 220. We have a fragment of a piece of the New Testament from almost 100 years earlier, maybe 100 years. It's hard to date these things. The way they date manuscripts is on the basis of handwriting analysis, basically. I mean, to simplify things, it's on the basis of handwriting analysis. There are scholars who are called paleographers, who are able to look at a Greek manuscript and on the basis of the style of the handwriting, tell you when it was written within about 50 years.
Just right quick, because Wes Huff is everywhere. Wes Huff is a paleographer. That's his field. Anyway, let's keep going.
Well, so we have this scrap called P52, the 52nd papyrus catalog, which is a tiny scrap, probably from the early 2nd century, so maybe 180 years or 100 years before P45. It's a little credit card-sized fragment. It's about the size of a credit card, written on both front and back, that contains some parts of some verses from John chapter 18. The trial of Jesus before Pilate. It doesn't contain any complete verses. It is a triangular-shaped fragment that was discovered in the basement of the John Rylands Library in England, where scholars realized what it was. It was discovered someplace in Egypt, as all these papyri were. So it gives us a few verses, which is great.
Just right quick, I think it was Oxyrhynchus. I think that was where it was found. Anyway, let's keep going.
I mean, it's great to know that you had a copy of John floating around in the early 2nd century, but it's just a few lines. It isn't very much. The vast majority of our manuscripts that survive are from after the 9th century. From after the 9th century. So if these books, if all the books of the New Testament are written in the 1st century, as almost everybody thinks, then we don't really start getting lots of copies until the 9th century. These 9th century manuscripts we have are abundant. We have thousands of manuscripts from the 9th century, the 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, and so forth. But that's not the problem. It's nice that we have these later manuscripts, but they're based on earlier manuscripts, which were based on earlier manuscripts, which were based on earlier manuscripts, and we don't know how good those manuscripts were. That's the problem.
So what is his point? That because we don't know how good things we don't have are, we should question what we do have and what we do have in abundance and what we do have that, has matched for thousands of years? Okay. Anyway.
As a result of the copying practices, there are lots of mistakes found in our surviving copies. Lots of mistakes. In the year 1707, so long time ago, in the year 1707, there was a scholar at Oxford whose name was John Mill, who decided to publish an edition of the Greek New Testament, in which he had studied some Greek manuscripts that were available to him of the Greek New Testament. He studied 100 manuscripts, and he made a note of wherever these manuscripts had differences, where they disagreed with one another and how to word a sentence. He didn't note all the differences, just the ones that he thought were important. And so he made a note of all what he thought were the important differences in the manuscripts, and he then produced an edition of the Greek New Testament. At the top of the page, he wrote out a line or two or three or five of the Greek New Testament, and at the bottom of the page, he listed the places where he had found different readings, what we call variant readings. And so he did this page after page for the entire New Testament. Where among the 100 manuscripts he examined, he had found differences. To the shock and dismay of many of his readers, John Mill's Greek New Testament contained 30,000 places of variation among the manuscripts that he had examined. 30,000 places where the manuscripts differed from one another. This really upset some people. There were people who claimed that John Mill was trying to render the text of the New Testament uncertain. His supporters pointed out he didn't invent these 30,000 places. He just noted that they exist.
Now, what he's probably getting ready to point out is sort of obvious, that when you say difference, what do you mean? Do you mean missed a period, missed a comma, wrote a letter a little different? These are the kinds of things he's talking about, but we'll get into it.
Well, that was 300 years ago, and it was based on a study of 100 manuscripts. Now we have 5,600 manuscripts. How many differences do we know about today? The reality is, nobody knows. Nobody has been able to count all the differences in our manuscripts. Some scholars say there are 200,000 differences. Some say there are 300,000 differences. Some say there are 400,000 differences. We don't know. Even with the advances of computer technology, we don't know. One thing we can say for certain is that there are more differences in our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament.
There are so many errors. How many of those manuscripts say Jesus didn't resurrect? How many? How many do you think? Anyway, let's keep going.
There are a lot of differences in the manuscripts, and those are just the manuscripts we have.
So many.
How many differences were there earlier? We don't know. Now, what kind of mistakes do we have in these manuscripts? So, just to be quite clear about this, most of these 300,000, 400,000 differences are completely immaterial, insignificant, and don't matter for a thing other than to show that scribes in the ancient world could spell no better than my students can today.
Okay, pause. That's accurate. The overwhelming majority. It's over 90%. But anyway, keep going.
And you know, they didn't have dictionaries. They certainly didn't have spell check. I mean, these students today, how can you possibly misspell a word? The computer puts a red line under it. I mean, how dumb do you have to be to misspell a word? Well, scribes didn't have that. And so, you know, the majority of differences, I mean, if you just count them up, are probably misspelling words. These are what I would call an accidental kind of change. Scribes just couldn't spell. And you know the scribes actually didn't care how they spelled, because sometimes you'll have the same word like 2 lines later, spelled differently. They did, it wasn't an issue for that. Well, those are differences. And so, well, who cares about spelling differences? Well, most of us don't care that much. There actually are some spelling differences that matter, but most spelling differences don't matter for anything. There are other kinds of accidental mistakes that you find in manuscript. I mean, scribes often were incompetent, or they were sleepy, or they were inattentive, and so they made mistakes. Scribes sometimes would leave out a letter. Sometimes they'd leave out a word. They would often leave out an entire line. Their eye would skip from one line to the next line, and so they would leave out a line. There are some manuscripts where scribes have left out a page. Well, that's an inattentive scribe. There are other places where scribes accidentally copy the same word twice, or the same line twice. I don't know of any instances of copying the same page twice. So these are.
And then, of course, there's those scribes who added the resurrection to the story of a dead Jesus. Anyway, let's keep going.
What I would call accidental changes. They are by far the majority of the variations that we have in our manuscripts. And the thing is, these accidental mistakes are usually pretty easy. If you're trained, they're pretty easy to catch, and you can see where it's happened. And so they're not all that significant for trying to know what the authors said. But I do have to say this about the accidental changes. There probably were even more accidental changes in the years before we have surviving manuscripts. Now, my reason for thinking that is this. By the time...
Okay, so I'm going to stop a second. So what is he saying? A scribe tripped and fell, and his pen just went, oh, resurrection. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, mistakes. All right, let's keep going.
Time you get to, say, the Middle Ages, who is copying manuscripts? The people copying manuscripts in the Middle Ages are the highly educated, literate people who are monks in monasteries who are trained to copy manuscripts. Those are the people who copied manuscripts in the Middle Ages. Well, you didn't have monks in the 4th century, so when we first start getting complete manuscripts, who was copying them then if you don't have monks in...
Okay. You didn't have monks in the 4th century. Is that what he said? You didn't have monks in the 4th century. Sir, we've had priests since the 12 disciples. The apostles spent inordinate amounts of time trying to be literate. We have whole sections of scripture where it talks about they're going through the manuscripts of the Old Testament and so on. So what's he talking about? Oh, they were illiterate. That part was made up. That was a later scribe adding to the story, right? Okay. Prove it. Let's keep going.
monasteries yet. Well, then the people copying them in the 4th century, at least the 4th century manuscripts we have, are pretty good. So they're written by highly literate people who appear to be trained to copy manuscripts in the 4th century. But things start changing when you start getting earlier. The manuscripts in the 3rd century aren't nearly as good as the manuscripts in the 4th century. The scribes don't appear to be trained. When you get to the 2nd century, many of the manuscripts, we don't have much. We just have fragments here and there from the 2nd century, but they're not nearly as good as those 4th century manuscripts. Who was copying the manuscripts to begin with? The reality is that most people in the ancient world were illiterate. This seems strange to us today because almost everybody we know is basically literate. I mean, literacy is still a big problem in this country, but 99% of the population in the United States can at least read the sports page. In the ancient world, maybe 10% of the population could read the sports page. They didn't have sports pages, but it could, in theory, have read the sports page. Most people couldn't read. Most people couldn't write. Who copied the manuscripts? In the early Christian churches, probably whoever the guy was in the church who at least could read something was the person who copied the manuscript. Was he trained as a scribe? No. Well, then, how good was he? Probably not very good. He probably made accidental mistakes that got replicated and replicated and replicated until our surviving manuscript. Probably. I mean, I don't know. Nobody knows. Dan doesn't know. Now, he's going to tell you he knows, but I'm telling you, he doesn't know.
Okay, just stop there for a second. He's going to tell you that he knows, but I'm going to tell you he doesn't know. Now, obviously, that's a funny way of stating it, but it's you can't say that you don't know when all evidence points to a single conclusion. You really shouldn't be saying that something with zero evidence. Again, this is a philosophy of science kind of thing. You cannot say that something is probable with zero evidence when other things are evidenced, just maybe not the evidence you would like, that those things either didn't happen or happened differently or were talked about differently or whatever it is Bart is trying to say from no attestation at all. Anyway, let's keep going.
In addition to the accidental mistakes, there are intentional mistakes, which are by far the most interesting kinds of mistakes. And I'm going to give you several examples of ones that strike me as rather significant.
1 John 5:7.
Changes where a scribe...
I'm going to lay money down. I'm betting on this. He's going to mention 1 John 5:7, which we've already talked about.
It looks like he's intentionally changing something. Now, we don't have the scribes around to interview, so we don't know that they intentionally changed. I mean, we can't ask them, did you do this on purpose or not? But you're going to see from these examples, it looks like somebody's doing this on purpose.
Well, also, he's probably going to mention the attitude of Jesus in a certain situation. I don't remember where that's at, but one section says, Jesus is angry. The other section basically said he had pity on the person, and it's more than likely that he was angry is the actual reading. But anyway, let's keep going.
Probably. If not, it's just a massive accident, but they still are important changes. And so we'll look at those. Before, I just want to make one final point, that the earliest scribes were much worse than the later scribes. They certainly made a lot more accidental changes. They may have made a lot more intentional changes, and there's no way for us to know.
They may have made many more intentional changes, and there's no way for us to know. Now, why would Bart, a historian, say, hey, we can't know anything about this whole situation when the situation itself only exists through the attestations that he's critiquing? So he's pretending to make an internal critique of the text while trying to make this external point that just throws shade on the text. Not only as it exists now, but as it ever existed by evidence. But anyway, let's keep going.
Let me tell you about some of the intentional changes. I'll just give you a list of ones that these will be passages that if you know your Bibles well, which I have a strange feeling you do, unlike my students at Chapel Hill, these will be passages that you probably know about. In the King James Bible, 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, provide.
Ding, 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 ding. 1 John 5:7. What'd I tell you? Yeah, it's the most common one.
Provides us with the only place in the entire New Testament where the doctrine of the Trinity is explicitly taught. The doctrine of the Trinity is that there are three persons in the Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And those are not three gods, the three are one. 1 John chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, in the King James Bible refers to there are three in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. That's in the King James Bible, but it's not in the Greek manuscript. You get it, it's actually in a few Greek manuscripts, and it's in Latin manuscripts, which was at the heart of the Latin Vulgate. It's an important verse because, as I said, you can intuit or you can reason towards the Trinity from other passages in the New Testament. This is the only passage that explicitly teaches it, and it wasn't originally in the New Testament. Dan and I do not disagree on this point. This verse was not originally in the New Testament. Is it an important verse? Well, it was for my grandfather. When the Revised Standard Version came out in 1952, he went through the roof because it didn't have the teaching of the Trinity. They took out the Trinity. This was a huge offense. Not nearly as offensive as I would be to him, but it was a huge offense. Well, it's a rather important matter whether this verse is in there or not. Is Jesus ever called the unique God in the New Testament? It depends which manuscript you trust for.
Okay. I did not anticipate the John 1:18 verse being in this discussion. I'm not super familiar with that one, but let's hear him out here.
John chapter 1, verse 18. Some of our manuscripts, the manuscripts that some textual scholars prefer and others don't prefer, some in this verse talk about Jesus as the unique God. No one has seen the Father at any time. The unique Son or the unique God who is in the bosom of the Father, that one has made him known. Is Jesus actually the unique God himself? Or is he the Son of God? Both are important, but it does matter whether Jesus is called God, the God, in the New Testament. Depends what you do with John chapter 1, verse 18. Does the Gospel of Luke teach a doctrine of atonement? The doctrine of atonement is that Christ's death is the death for sins. Luke, interestingly, changes a number of verses that he found in his predecessor, the Gospel of Mark, which talked about Jesus as an atonement for sins. Okay, so this is a little bit complicated, but everybody, most Bible scholars, I think most Bible scholars agree that Mark was the first gospel written and that Luke copied Mark for some of his stories, and he got stories from other sources. One of the verses in Mark is a very famous verse from Mark chapter 10. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Mm-hmm. This is a verse that Luke excluded when he gave his account of Jesus' life. He doesn't include that verse for whatever reason. It is striking that the only place where Luke's ideas about Jesus' death indicate that his death was an atonement for sins is in the passage Luke 22, verses 19 and 20, where Jesus it's at the Last Supper. Jesus, in Luke's gospel, Jesus first gives the cup before he gives the bread. This is the cup of the new covenant, etc. Then he gives the bread. This is my body broken. And then, in some manuscripts, it doesn't just say, this is my body that's been broken. It says, this is my body that has been broken for you. And then it goes on to say, this cup is the covenant of my blood, which is shed for you. The death of Jesus for the sake of others, which is otherwise missing in Luke. And you say, well, so what if it's missing in Luke? It's in Matthew. Okay, but does it matter what Luke says or not? Say, no, it doesn't matter. It just matters what Matthew says. Really? Luke doesn't have a doctrine of atonement depending on which manuscripts you trust for chapter 22.
Okay, let's stop that because that's quite enough. All the Gospels have a doctrine of atonement. Now, they may characterize it differently, or even the earlier Gospels may not quite understand the fullness of atonement of the sacrifice of Jesus. But what does that attest to? It attests to their early authorship. They hadn't theologically understood yet what the resurrection, what the death and resurrection had meant. It was too early. They hadn't had time to think about it, to understand what happened, to remember the things Jesus said and remember the allusions that he made to his own death, to what it meant, to who it was for. Anyway, let's keep going.
The favorite story of many Bible readers of Jesus is the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery. Jesus...
Okay, I should have called that one too. The story of the woman taken in adultery doesn't appear in any old manuscripts. It's clear it was added later. Now, does that mean it's inauthentic? It could have been a story that was in the community that somebody thought, oh, it should be in a gospel somewhere, and so they put it in. But does that mean it didn't happen? Who knows, right? Nobody can know if it happened or not. Anyway, let's keep going.
Is teaching in the temple. Y'all know the story. It's in all the Jesus movies. This story is so good, you can't leave it out of a Jesus movie. When Mel Gibson made The Passion of the Christ, even though it was about Jesus' last hours, he had to include the story, so he included it as a flashback, right? Jesus was remembering this happened, because you can't make a Jesus movie without the woman taken in adultery. Let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. It's found in manuscripts of the Gospel of John, but it's not originally in the Gospel of John, probably, because it's not in the earliest manuscripts of John. It's a story that was added later after our earliest manuscripts. How many stories were added before our earliest manuscripts? We have no way of knowing. They may have been some of our favorite stories. How would we know? We can't know. We don't have any evidence. The last 12 verses of Mark, where Jesus appears to his disciples and tells them that anyone who converts and believes in him will be able to speak in foreign tongues.
I also should have called that one the different recensions of the end of Mark. Now he's probably not going to tell you, but in manuscripts, sometimes you have three versions. You'll have a short ending, a long ending, and a middle recension. And oftentimes, if a manuscript gets cut off, they have to stop copying for some reason. So you can't say the short version is the version. And then a lot of times they'll want to add ancillary details or spin it a different way or add explanations. So long recensions are often also wrong. Most of the time it's the middle recension. So he's going to try to say that, well, the end of the Gospel of Mark ends differently. Oh, and it stops where the women, they didn't tell anybody. But it's sort of obvious if you read up to where he's going to talk about. If you read up to before was it 16, whatever verse, you're going to see it's like an abrupt stop. It's sort of obvious there's more to come. This is not an end. There's not a wind down or anything. It's very abrupt. So obviously it's at that middle recension is the most likely accurate version. But anyway, let's keep going.
Will be able to handle deadly snakes, will drink poison and it won't hurt them. Those verses are not found in the oldest and best manuscripts of Mark. These are the verses used by the Appalachian snake handlers in my part of the world. I've always thought that on the way to the hospital, somebody should tell one of these people, actually, you know, those verses aren't in the original copy. Did Jesus pray, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing? It's found only in Luke, but it may not be in Luke because some manuscripts lack it. You can see these are pretty important verses. So even though most of the changes are accidental, some of the intentional ones really matter. Is the text of the New Testament reliable? The short answer is there is no way to tell. How can we possibly know, given the kinds of evidence we have? There are passages that scholars continue to debate. Scholars disagree on this verse or that verse, sometimes important verses. They debate because we can't know. There are passages where we will never know what the original wording was. Does it matter? In my view, the answer is absolutely yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ehrman.
Okay, I am going to stop it there. Like I said before, I don't want to take all the material from the debate and so on, but I'm going to have to stop it here because we are looking at... it's going to be probably over an hour when I get done editing this, and editing it down and cutting everything down. So anyway, long story short, I'm going to just stop it there at the opening statements of Bart Ehrman, and I'll probably do another video where I will watch the opening statements of Dan Wallace. But this has been Lion of Amos, and I really appreciate you guys watching this with me. And I hope you enjoyed some of my commentary, and we'll be doing this again. So I appreciate it a lot, guys, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.